So good afternoon, everybody from Los Angeles, where I'm currently based. My name is Lesley Blume, and I wrote the book Fallout, the Hiroshima Cover-up and the reporter who revealed it to the world. And this book was released by Simon & Schuster last August to commemorate the 75th anniversary of the bombing of Hiroshima. Fallout documents how the US government attempted to cover up the true radioactive aftermath in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and how only one reporter got into Hiroshima, interviewed survivors on the ground, and then managed to detail the actual aftermath in the atomic city and reveal the true nature of nuclear weapons to a global audience. So the reporter in question is, of course, John Hersey, who not only graduated from Yale in 1936, but later became master of Pearson College at the university, and also taught at the school for nearly 2 decades, I believe. Hersey donated all of his papers to his alma mater, including the handwritten first draft of Hiroshima, his deeply influential article, which was released in the New Yorker's August 31st, 1946 issue, which is exactly 75 years ago. So for somebody as famously reticent and publicity shy as Hersey, he kept and donated a very full record of his life and career from its earliest days. And the Hersey archives at Beinecke are a wonder. They include scores of boxes and records, including press clippings from across the country and around the world, documenting his life and his achievements and his controversies. They include hundreds of letters, his reporting notes, his book drafts, invitations to the White House, you name it. So I was slated to research and write Fallout on a harrowing deadline, or what counts for a harrowing deadline in the nonfiction book world. It was commissioned in 2016, and it had to be ready in time for, it had to be ready to be released on the anniversary of the Hiroshima bombing. And I was facing research on 3 continents in 4 languages, and I knew that the documents and the artifacts at the Beinecke were going to contain many leads to be followed up around the world. I truly don't know if I could have pulled this off, if not for 2 saving graces. And firstly, the supportive, incredible staff at the Beinecke, including Jessica Tubis and Anne-Marie Menta, who helped so much when I was off-site and on-site, and I'm profoundly grateful to both of them. And my second saving grace was my crack research associate, more of a research comrade, really, who is Professor Anastasia Osipova, who has joined me here today. And she is also going to talk with me about the roster of crucial Hersey artifacts that we've chosen to highlight in this talk. So I originally brought Anastasia on board as a Russian translator and researcher for, if you read Fallout, you'll see that it's as much of a Cold War book as it is a World War II narrative. It became immediately obvious to me that she was an archival animal like me, and so I asked her to become the project's general researcher. We worked side by side in archives. I mean, we were like a couple of maniacs. We don't even sit down. We just stand over the documents, scanning them, thrashing through them like machines. And this is actually more fun than it sounds. And as I'm West Coast based, in times when I wasn't able to be physically present in archives, Anastasia, who was then based in New York City, would go to archives in my stead, including Yale, and spent much more time there than I did even. So she has as deep a relationship with these Yale materials as I do. So for today's presentation, again, we've created a slideshow of some of the materials that proved especially important in Fallout's genesis. And I have to say, it was absolutely thrilling to hold many of these materials in 3D, seeing and handling them, brought the history to life so vividly. And I hope that you enjoy seeing them, and we will leave plenty of time for questions. Well, a little bit of time anyway. So in this first slide, already on your screens, this is Mr. John Hersey in 1946. And a quick overview about Mr. Hersey. He's shown here in spring of 1946 in China, just before he has made his way to Japan to report on Hiroshima. He was at the time a renowned war correspondent for Time Inc. He had been since 1939. He'd won a Pulitzer Prize for his wartime novel, A Bell for Adano. And on top of that, he's a commended war hero. So he had helped to evacuate wounded Marines while covering a battle with Japanese in the Solomon Islands. So Henry Luce the founder of Time, had been grooming him, Hersey, to become the heir apparent of Time Inc. while Hersey was still in the field. In Moscow, namely, having founded their bureau there in 1944, until the two men parted ways unamicably. And I'll let Anastasia talk a little bit here about that.
Thank you, Lesley. I cannot resist pointing out that it was Russia that was at the core of this agreement between Henry Luce and John Hersey. Moreover, the nature of their fight in many ways prefigures the logic of the Cold War. At Beinecke, we found many letters and telegrams that were exchanged between Luce and Hersey, while Hersey was stationed in Moscow as a foreign correspondent, and Luce was trying to recruit Hersey as the next editor for Time. These documents, held in Beinecke, shed light on what was at stake behind their eventual falling out. Hersey had held a rather balanced view of the Soviet Union. While certainly not a fan of Stalin and not a communist, he did recognize Soviet accomplishments in fighting the war. This came at odds with Luce's increasing, after 1943, suspicion of all things Soviet. Hersey complained that during his time as a Moscow correspondent, no single editor at Time read his articles from start to finish, and that his reports were edited beyond recognition to better suit Luce's new ideological mold. With all this frustration mounting, it is hardly a surprise that when the time came to publish Hiroshima, Hersey went to the New Yorker, which at the time was Time's #1 competitor. They had a very bitter feud. And once that happened, Luce had Hersey's picture taken down from Time Inc.'s Gallery of Honor in the most dramatic fashion.
Yeah, we can't overstate how much Henry Luce and the New Yorker founder Harold Ross hated each other. I mean, it was a pretty famous feud covered in East Coast papers, and they were both pretty outsized characters. So that honestly was quite an archival bit of delight for us in an otherwise very somber project. So in the summer of 1945, when the bombs are detonated over Japan, Hersey he's a freelancer instead of being Luce's heir. He first heard the news about the atomic bombing of Hiroshima on the radio, and he later recalled that he was devastated. But he also felt, as many Americans did at the time, that there was some good in the bomb having been dropped, because he felt that it would speed the end of the war and stave off a costly land invasion. But then 3 days later, when Nagasaki is bombed, Hersey is truly horrified. And he said later that he felt that it was essentially a war crime. He knew that he was going to write about the bombs at that moment. He just didn't know yet in what capacity he was going to be writing about the bombs. So shortly after the bombings, he hears from his friend, New York Times war correspondent Bill Lawrence, who later became a famous ABC News reporter, my network alma mater. Hersey had known Lawrence in Moscow. And Anastasia, because you got the pleasure of reviewing their correspondence, I was wondering if you could talk about it here.
Of course. Right. So Beinecke holds a very large, extensive, detailed, and truly fascinating collection of letters that Hersey wrote to his first wife, Frances M, while he was stationed in Moscow as a foreign correspondent for the Time. That was in 1944. He was placed in a magnificent yet very poorly heated Hotel Metropole in the heart of Moscow, a residence that was very closely watched by the KGB. And Hersey spent most of his free time playing cards and drinking hard liquor with other foreign reporters, as well as British and American diplomats and military personnel. Bill Lawrence was part of this group, and that he would later describe as, quote, their Moscow poker, dice, and cold hand society. Hersey did not speak Russian, and his movements were very highly restricted and controlled. In other words, he could not go anywhere where his handlers didn't allow him to go. And so while in Moscow, he writes about meetings with people like Sergei Eisenstein, Prokofiev, Shostakovich. He meets all of them during officially sanctioned parties and meetings. And it would be an exaggeration to say, so Hersey doesn't really gain an understanding of what Russia really was on the ground. Yet, inside the freezing Art Nouveau metropole, warming himself up with vodka and whiskey, he does make very crucial connections among a high-ranking American and British politicians and military personnel who would prove very useful to him later down the line when the time would come for him to do the research in Japan on Hiroshima and to promote his book.
So Bill Lawrence is one of those fellows, and they're extremely close friends. And when Hersey comes home to the States after resigning as Moscow bureau chief and resigning from Time, Bill Lawrence stays in covering the war, and he's in the Pacific Theater. He covers Tokyo bombing runs. He covered Okinawa, and he's in touch with Hersey throughout. So in September of 1945, Hersey gets this letter from Lawrence, which we found in Beinecke's archives. And it was quite a bragging letter in which he described a press junket that he had been on with a group of other reporters from prestigious news outlets. And it was led by a US Air Force publicity man who had taken the group into Hiroshima and Nagasaki to show off the damage there, thanks to the US's new atomic mega weapon. And so even though the experience had been harrowing, Lawrence was clearly giddy about the scoop as he relays in this letter. And he boasts about it to Hersey, who's back in New York and on the reporting sidelines then. And this letter gave us insight into that crucial junket, which illustrated the central conflict the US initially faced in the post-bombing publicizing of Hiroshima's devastation. And that was namely, how much to showcase of the bomb's might versus how much to hide about its radioactive qualities. So, on the one hand, the US government wants to broadcast its advantage, but on the other hand, it's about to move tens of thousands of Allied troops into Japan to occupy it, including into Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And so the optics of moving those troops in whose names the bombs had been dropped, supposedly to spare them a deadly invasion, into a smoldering and possibly radioactive ruin, again, were terrible optics. So here's the back half of that letter. The junket publicist who had led the junket that Bill Lawrence and his colleagues were on, he encouraged the junket correspondents, including Lawrence, to downplay what they had been shown in Hiroshima. And he said, quotes, quote, "The folks at home are not quite ready for it yet," he told them. And the correspondents largely complied. And that publicist would later admit that when it came to revealing to Hiroshima's true aftermath, he said, quote, "I covered it up and John Hersey uncovered it." My editor amusingly calls this PR guy his own deep throat. So anyway, Bill Lawrence's letter here, really did, again, give insight to what the junket had been like in the first place and gave us a lot of important material for that chapter in Fallout. So later in 1945, John Hersey decides with his editor at the New Yorker, William Shawn, because he's now freelance, and one of the publications that he's working with is the New Yorker. They decided together that there was something off up to that point about the predominant bomb coverage, and there had been no real reporting on the bomb's effects on human beings. There had been plenty of reporting on the widescape landscape devastation. Statistics were being thrown around like, oh, this was 20,000 tons of TNT. This devastated 68,000 buildings, but there was no really substantial reporting on the devastating after effects of radioactive weaponry. So Hersey and Shawn decide that Hersey is going to try to get into Japan, which is now totally under the control of General Douglas MacArthur. So getting into Japan was easier said than done. And Anastasia, I'll let you take this part.
Right. So to better understand the process of how journalists were vetted by the MacArthur's forces and how their movements were monitored, if indeed they were lucky enough to be allowed into Japan, we decided to pay a visit to NARA, the National Archives and Records Administration in College Park, located just outside of Washington, D.C. There, I have sifted through a small mountain of documents pertaining to daily operations of MacArthur's press relations office in Japan. Most of those papers have not been touched since the 1940s and were accumulating generous piles of historical dust. I've also been informed by the librarian at NARA that about only 1% to 3% of all governmental documents gets preserved. And yet from what we did find there, it became really abundantly clear just how thin Douglas MacArthur's skin was when it came to dealing with the press. PRO, his press relations office, had both domestic and foreign, especially actually Russian and Japanese press, closely monitored for publications pertaining to anything that had to do with American occupation in Japan. Briefings and summaries would be prepared daily. And if any of the publications were deemed hostile to the occupation, their representatives would be banned from Japan.
That counts for American press outlets as well as Japanese and Russian.
Precisely. Thank you, Lesley. And so when the reporters were in fact allowed into Japan, they would remain under very close scrutiny and supervision by their military handlers. Even the gas for their cars would be rationed by the MacArthur office. And Lesley could tell you more about that.
Yeah, well, there was a joke among the correspondents that, you know, the army would, I mean, they controlled everything. They said the army would tell you how much food to eat, how much whiskey you could drink, and how many cigarettes you could smoke a day. I mean, it was regulated on that level of minutia. And in the records that Anastasia and I found at NARA, I mean, it was pretty astonishing. I mean, there were daily reports on American publications. You know, it was noted, you know, the health status of correspondents was noticed. I mean, it was pretty pervasive how monitored you were. Hersey, though, in gaining access to the country and being vetted ahead of time, had advantages that other correspondents did not. So Hersey had essentially been a pretty great team player with the US military throughout World War II. I mean, he'd been embedded with military units on several fronts. He had written flattering articles about members of the Allied forces, you know, from major figures to the rank and file, some of them for the New Yorker magazine. And perhaps most importantly, for you know, the purposes of gaining access to Japan, Hersey had written a flattering wartime book about General MacArthur himself, Men on Bataan. And Hersey said later that he wished that Knopf would take that book out of publication, out of circulation, because he felt that it was, you know, in hindsight, too flattering. But, you know, if you're applying for access to MacArthur's occupied kingdom, then that's probably going to help considerably. And bingo, while Hersey's in China doing reporting for the New Yorker, he applies for clearance to Japan, and he got it. We found this clearance documentation in his Beinecke files, which was a very good day. You can see that he is cleared in sort of mid-May. No objection on entrance of John Hersey as correspondent for Time. Hersey is then offered military transport into Japan on May 22nd, 1946. And as you can see from the stamps below, on May 22nd, he flies from Shanghai to Guam and then from Guam into Tokyo. So again, these travel documents were crucial in terms of, you know, helping us just recreate the narrative of his movements through Asia and eventually into Japan. And then once he gets into Tokyo, Hersey applied for clearance to travel to Hiroshima Prefecture, and he got it, which was kind of stunning. We were this was a big piece of evidence for us. Hiroshima and Nagasaki at the time were still restricted topics. This, you know, as you can see above, is still May 1946. And, you know, an occupation press code restricted Japanese reporters and nationals from even mentioning Hiroshima in poetry, much less a press report. And, you know, as Anastasia has detailed, you know, Allied reporters were still very controlled by MacArthur's forces, again, controlling all food, gas, transport. They had to not only approve reporters' travels throughout the country, but they even gave you a cap on the amount of time that you could spend in different parts of the country. So here you see Hersey's been allowed to travel down to the southern part of the country for 14 days and come back. Now, for the magnitude of the story that he was determined to report, that is not a lot of time, because that includes travel time through a war-torn country. It includes getting down, situating yourself on the ground, finding translators, finding subjects, interviewing them, and then, you know, coming back up to Tokyo and getting out of Dodge. So again, Hersey must not have seemed to MacArthur's PROs or press relation officers to be too much of a threat if they gave him this kind of access. But also by then, even though Hiroshima was a restricted topic, it was also increasingly being seen as, quote, an old story. We see this time and again in reporters' memoirs of that period. So the perceived danger on behalf of a PRO, of a reporter, especially somebody of Hersey's stature, writing something truly revelatory and embarrassing almost a year after the bombing probably seemed increasingly unlikely. And so as you can see, he's given 2 weeks on the ground there. So here is another item that we found, and it was just the most remarkable find, and it took some parsing to ID all the people and locations noted on this envelope in Hersey's hand. This is was just a soiled envelope that we found that turned out to be kind of the key to all of his contacts on the ground in Tokyo as he's preparing to go down south and go to Hiroshima. And it also confirmed other research that we had done on certain meetings that Hersey had there, such as a meeting with Lieutenant Daniel McGovern. Let me see if I can highlight, where are you? There you are, right there. Who had been on the ground in Hiroshima filming for the US military, capturing early color footage of the damage and the fallout in Hiroshima. And one of McGovern's colleagues, Lieutenant Susan, made sure that that film unit was also documenting victims of the human fallout. So these were very important contacts for Hersey as he's preparing to go to Hiroshima himself. Incidentally, the military footage that was taken by McGovern and Susan was classified and would not be released by the US military for decades. But these military filmmakers did meet with Hersey in Tokyo and later said that they had given him guidance before his own trip to Hiroshima. Anastasia, do you want to talk maybe about a few other things that we found alongside these envelopes?
Just to quick 2 details. It was I just can't emphasize enough how crucial this 2 little slips of paper that we found in this little folder were. Included with the list of the Hersey's contacts were also photos, portrait photographs of the victims of the atomic bombing, and we do not know whether Hersey took them himself or whether they were given to him, but they're really shocking, and that probably set the tone for his human interest of the story. And then the other detail is that the envelope did contain a business card of a worker of the Soviet embassy by the last name of Warshawski, who was one of the first people from Soviet delegation to see the devastation of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And it's just a conjunction, but perhaps because at this point in time, Hersey had very good relations with Moscow, he was possibly given some context or guidance by the worker from the Russian embassy, Soviet embassy.
Yeah, this actually, the envelope that we're looking at right now was I just have to say, I feel like it was just the key to everything. It just opened everything up. We won't go into enormous details, but I will show you one thing before we move on to the bottom. It says here, German priest. So that's crucial because when Hersey got to Hiroshima, he does indeed seek out some German priests who had been living in Hiroshima and survived the blast. And one of them had written a harrowing eyewitness account of his experience on August 6th, which Hersey had read in translation before coming to Hiroshima. So he sought out German priests, these German priests who were there in Hiroshima rebuilding as an entrance point sort of into the survivor community. And one of the priests, Father Wilhelm Kleinsorge, not only became one of the protagonists in Hersey's subsequent report, but also one of his translators. And he introduced him to another one of his protagonists, Reverend Kiyoshi Tanemoto, pictured here, who, along with his young family, had survived the bombing. And Tanemoto is also, his materials that were at Beinecke were unbelievably essential to the research for fallout. In many ways, his account is much more detailed than Hersey's own Hiroshima, and down to the minute. We'll get to that in a second. I'm getting ahead of myself. When Hersey first came to, or was first brought to Tanimoto's house by Father Kleinsorge for introduction, Reverend Tanimoto was not at home. Tanimoto's house, by the way, I say house, but it was really like a shack that was on the ruins of his former home, because he, like everybody else, was in the process of rebuilding and trying to rebuild his church. And Hersey left his card with Tanimoto's wife, who had also survived the bombing. And when Tanimoto got home that night, he was worried that Hersey wouldn't come back, and so, or he wouldn't connect with him somehow. So he sat down until, you know, the wee hours of the morning, and he wrote him a long letter in English detailing his experience of the bombing on that terrible day. Tanimoto had gone to Emory University in the United States, and his English was very good. And so this letter is also among Hersey's Beinecke papers, along with Tanimoto's lengthy unpublished diary, again, which was just deeply crucial as I researched the days and the weeks following the bombing. And he talks about Hersey in those diaries also, and his meeting with Hersey, and it just really helped create a sense of place and helped us retrace Hersey's own steps and his methodology when it came to interviewing his subjects. And so Hersey got the letter, and he did come back. He did a long subsequent interview with Tanimoto, who also walked Hersey around the ruins afterwards and became one of his introducers to other survivors, Habakusha, and one of his translators. And here is another item that Reverend Tanimoto left for Hersey, also in the Beinecke folders. It's a map of the city and all the places he describes in that letter, in case Hersey had wanted to retrace on his own the Tanimoto's own movements. So Hersey's article. So ultimately, Tanimoto and Kleinsorge, for Hersey's article, introduced Hersey to dozens of blast survivors, and then again helped him to interview those survivors. And of those dozens, and I have to say later, Hersey did not remember exactly how many he had spoken to, but we narrowed it down to the framework of dozens, probably between 2 and 4 dozen. Of those people, he chose these 6 protagonists depicted here in a Japanese publication in the early 1950s. And so in addition to Father Kleinsorge, who is right here, and Reverend Tanimoto, we have a young Japanese medic. We have a Japanese mother who had 3 young children, a young female clerk, and an older Japanese doctor who was proprietor of a private hospital in Hiroshima, and their names would soon become famous around the world. So Hersey came back home to the States to write the story. The New Yorker's William Shawn had advised him to do so, and that way they felt that Hersey could avoid the beady eyes of MacArthur's censors, who had suppressed other press accounts of atomic aftermath in Hiroshima. So Hersey came back to New York, and he wrote the approximately 30,000 word draft in a matter of weeks. And it's pretty incredible how much of it stayed intact from the first draft to the final draft. Although this draft that you see here contained a few passages that were omitted in the final, including some pretty interesting and angry language about how the US government would not be able to suppress information about Hiroshima indefinitely, and how the US was not going to be able to maintain its nuclear monopoly. When the story came out, Hersey donated the manuscript to Yale almost immediately, even though the Library of Congress also vied for it. And Hiroshima was considered, an instant classic, and the manuscript was deemed, immediately invaluable. But Yale got it and excitedly put out a giddy press release announcing the fact, which is also in the Beinecke Library. So Hersey's article comprised essentially the entire contents of the August 31st, 1946 issue. And, interestingly, no advertisers had been told about the special issue, and their ads for, like coffee and pantyhose ran alongside this horrifying account. Not even the writers or the staffers of the New Yorker, most of them anyway, had been told about the issue, and they largely found out about the controversial project along with the rest of the world. Here is the Hiroshima issue. The magazine's covers were usually selected months in advance. And this one, the one that had been originally slated to adorn this issue, was an illustration by the artist Charles E. Martin and depicted, a carefree scene in an unnamed park. And the New Yorker editors had chosen to keep Martin's summary picture on the Hiroshima issue. The editors did, however, grow concerned about the lack of advance warning to readers about the graphic context, the contents of the magazine. So the magazine's editor, Harold Ross, was able to, at the last minute, to get white bands notifying readers about the story inside around 40,000 of the New York newsstand copies. I had never actually seen one of these rare banded issues throughout the duration of our research until actually just a couple of weeks ago. A librarian at the John Hersey High School, Mr. Bruce Janu in Illinois, got in touch with me to do an interview. And during the Zoom interview, held this copy up. He had found it in a storage closet on the premises of the John Hersey High School. And I almost lost my mind when I saw it. I just saw this flash of white here in the middle, and I said, oh my goodness, hold this up again. So unfortunately, this is not in the Beinecke records. It's in the John Hersey High School vault. And the New Yorker just wrote a story about the finding of this rare banded issue last week, if you want to look it up. So Hersey's article, it was syndicated in public newspapers around the world. Hersey and his team only allowed it to be syndicated in its entirety. It could not be excerpted. It was turned by Knopf into a best-selling book immediately as well, and editions around the world sold too, and they were bestsellers around the globe. However, there were two places where Hersey's Hiroshima was notably not syndicated, translated, turned into a book, or even permitted to be read: the Soviet Union and Japan. Anastasia, will you take this?
Yes, I'll say a few words about the history of the publication of Hiroshima in Russia. So surprisingly, perhaps, the full and unabridged and unedited Russian translation of Hersey's Hiroshima came out only last year in 2020. And Lesley and I co-authored an article for the New York Times about the circumstances of this publication and the reason for why it took so long for it to appear. So I would direct you there if you would like to know more. But I'll just say that one of the central reasons for this delay was the fact that during the 1940s and 1950s, the Soviet Union was as interested in covering up the extent of the devastation and radioactive poisoning caused by the atomic bomb as the United States, albeit for different reasons. Russians felt that telling the truth about Hiroshima would provide an advertisement for American military might and would intimidate the Soviet population. So even though Russian observers were one of the first to witness the devastation in Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945, reporters from Pravda would still write that atomic fever was an invention of the American press. And so although Hersey did enjoy very good relations with the Russians until 1945, for instance, his book, The Bell for Adeno, was translated into Russian, and there were public, well-attended readings of it in Moscow in 1944. After the publication of Hiroshima in the States, Hersey becomes branded in Soviet newspapers as the American spy, as somebody who promotes American military spirit and is dedicating his life to the, quote, the propaganda of aggression, akin to sort of sadomasochistic impulses of the Nazis. Yes, and I'll let Lesley speak about the history of Hiroshima's publication in Japan.
So in Japan, Hiroshima's publication is suppressed until 1949 by occupation forces. And Hersey's team even had to try to sneak contraband copies of the article into the country in a box destined for a church, just to get the copies to the 6 protagonists. And it didn't reach many of them. Many of them didn't know for weeks, if not months afterwards, that they'd been featured in this now world famous article. So when the book was finally allowed to come out in Japan in 1949, it was an immediate bestseller. So that's about it. These are just a few of frankly, the hundreds of materials that we reviewed at Beinecke, and which helped us to reconstruct the backstory of Hersey's Hiroshima. And if you want to read Fallout, it just came out in paperback with an updated introduction and epilogue to reflect the nuclear threat and landscape in the post-Trump administration era. If you do buy it, we just ask that you please buy it from your local independent bookseller. And thank you all very much for joining us today and listening to our presentation. And we would be glad to take your softball questions now.